go. And they're going to stop it. They're going to stop it as Perret saves to the candle. Perret goes down from sheer exhaustion. Look at him there. As his handlers put his mouthpiece out. Dr. Schiffer's coming over to look at him. Perret has collapsed from exhaustion from that beating.
Boxing has always existed in two worlds. Inside the ring, it is skill, discipline, and controlled brutality. A place where violence transforms into art, and where two fighters agree to meet in a space governed by rules. Outside the ring, it is something entirely different. The roar of the crowd vanishes, the lights dim, and the same instincts that forge men into champions can seep into the everyday world, where there are no rules, no referees, and no second chances. This is the story of what happens when the fight doesn't end with the bell. This is the story of the ring's most haunting shadows. Edwin Valero was more than a boxer. He was a phenomenon, a man whose entire identity revolved around violence, speed, and destruction. In Venezuela, he was celebrated as a national symbol, a warrior who embodied the country's fighting spirit. But outside the spotlight, Valero was unraveling at a pace no one around him was willing to confront. His story is that of a boxer who became trapped by the very aggression that once made him a hero. Valero ascended through the professional ranks with a level of brutality rarely seen in modern boxing. 27 fights, 27 knockouts, a 100% knockout ratio that transformed him into a myth before he reached his prime. The Venezuelan press called him Dynamite. Others called him El Inca. To his fans, he was more than a fighter. He was a symbol of national pride, especially when he tattooed the Venezuelan flag and the face of President Hugo Chavez across his chest. Every punch he threw carried political weight. Every victory became a patriotic celebration. But beneath this image was a neurological problem hidden from the world. Years before his professional ascent, Valero suffered a severe motorcycle accident. He crashed head-first, sustaining a brain injury that should have ended his career before it began. Doctors found a cerebral hemorrhage. His license was suspended. Most fighters would have stopped. Valero didn't. He found ways to return, and those close to him celebrated the comeback without considering what that trauma implied. The impact had weakened the very organ responsible for controlling impulse and aggression. Combined with his lifestyle, the results were catastrophic. As he became more famous, Valero drowned himself in cocaine and alcohol. His addiction grew to the point where he could not function without it. Friends and trainers noticed manic behavior, paranoia, sudden mood swings, and episodes of explosive anger. He threatened doctors, fought with strangers, and lived in a constant state of agitation. His wife, Jennifer Vieira, became the silent witness to the champion's darkest side. She appeared in the hospital multiple times with broken ribs, punctured lungs, bruises, and deep fear in her eyes. Each time, Valero denied involvement. Each time, authorities hesitated to confront a national icon. The system enabled him. Judges protected him. The government praised him. Fans defended him. And the violence escalated. On April 18, 2010, everything reached its breaking point inside a hotel room in Valencia. Jennifer was found dead with stab wounds. Hours later, Valero walked to the reception desk and told the staff, "I killed her." He was not hiding. He was not running. He was falling apart so completely that the confession felt like a final release. Police arrested him, and for the first time, the myth collapsed. Headlines shifted from glory to tragedy. Inside the jail cell, Valero spent the night pacing, screaming, crying, and descending further into psychological chaos. By morning, he was dead. He had used his own pants to hang himself from a ventilation bar. Guards found him with faint signs of life, but it was too late. His death forced Venezuela to confront the truth it had ignored. Valero was not a hero destroyed by fame. He was a damaged man, shaped by trauma and fueled by a culture that worshipped his violence while overlooking his suffering. His story is the clearest example of what happens when society elevates aggression without accountability. In the ring, he was unstoppable. Outside of it, he was a man at war with his own mind. Boxer 2, Carlos Monzon, the idol who thought he was untouchable. Carlos Monzon did not rise to fame through chaos. He rose through discipline, calculation, and cold precision. Born into poverty in the slums of Santa Fe, Argentina, Monzon learned early that survival required toughness. Boxing became his path out, and he pursued it with a level of focus that bordered on obsession. By the 1970s, he was the undisputed middleweight champion of the world, a national hero and a symbol of Argentine pride. But behind that heroic image was a man whose sense of entitlement had grown into something dangerous. Monzon believed he could do anything, and for years, society affirmed that belief. Police ignored domestic violence complaints. Judges dismissed charges. Fans cheered his arrogance. The government treated him like royalty. Decades before the term existed, Monzon was the perfect example of celebrity immunity. His relationships were filled with violence. He regularly beat his partners. His first wife shot him during one of his outbursts. He was known for an explosive temper, heavy drinking, and the belief that no woman could challenge him. In his world, he was the ultimate authority. That mindset reached its tragic peak in 1988. Monzon traveled to the resort city of Mar del Plata with his estranged partner, the Uruguayan model Alicia Muñiz. Their relationship had already deteriorated into constant conflict, fueled by jealousy and Monzon's need for control. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, the argument spiraled out of control inside a rented home. Neighbors heard shouting, objects breaking, and Muñiz crying. Then everything went silent. Moments later, Muñiz's body was found below the balcony, lying broken in the courtyard. Monzon had also fallen, injuring his arm, and immediately claimed she had slipped. His story changed several times within the first hour. He said they struggled and fell together. He said she jumped. He said he tried to save her. But the autopsy exposed the truth. Alicia had been strangled before the fall. The marks around her neck showed prolonged pressure, indicating she had lost consciousness before she went over the balcony. It was not an accident. It was a homicide. For the first time in his life, Monzon could not escape consequences. His trial in 1989 became a national spectacle. Fans cried outside the courthouse. Journalists swarmed the building. Monzon walked in with the same arrogant posture he carried in the ring. He showed no remorse. He spoke as if he were the victim. He insisted that the world misunderstood him. The court disagreed. Monzon was sentenced to 11 years in prison. For the first time, Argentina was forced to confront the truth about its idol. He was not a hero who made a mistake. He was a violent man protected for too long by a society that celebrated his success more than it protected the women around him. In prison, Monzon used his fame to his advantage. He received privileges and special treatment. He remained popular. He was granted regular furloughs for good behavior. And during one of those furloughs, his story came to an abrupt end. On January 8, 1995, while driving back to prison after a weekend release, Monzon lost control of his car. Witnesses reported excessive speed. The vehicle flipped repeatedly and crashed violently, killing him instantly. The world mourned him as a fallen champion, but behind the nostalgia was the uncomfortable truth. Carlos Monzon was a boxer whose greatness in the ring allowed society to excuse his violence outside of it. His story serves as a reminder that talent does not erase responsibility and fame does not absolve guilt. Boxer 3. James Butler, the friend who turned into a killer. James Butler's life is a study in volatility. In the boxing world, he was known as the Harlem Hammer, a fighter with explosive power and a fierce reputation. But behind the gloves was a man struggling with mental illness, emotional instability, and deep insecurity. His career never reached the heights expected of him, and each disappointment became a new wound that he could not heal. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in November 2001. After losing a fight to Richard Grant, Butler walked toward his opponent with his arms open, appearing ready to hug him in a gesture of sportsmanship. Instead, he delivered a bare-knuckle punch to Grant's jaw, shattering it instantly. The crowd gasped. Commentators were stunned. Grant collapsed in agony. Butler was arrested for assault on the spot. It was one of the most shocking moments in modern boxing and a clear red flag that he was unraveling psychologically. Despite the controversy, some friends and professionals tried to help him. Among them was Sam Kellerman, a young writer, comedic talent, and the brother of boxing analyst Max Kellerman. Sam opened the doors of his Hollywood apartment to Butler when the boxer was struggling financially and emotionally. Their friendship was genuine, built on shared ambition and mutual support. But as Butler's mental instability worsened, tension grew inside the apartment. By 2004, Butler had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. His career was stagnant. He felt trapped and powerless. According to prosecutors, Sam eventually asked him to move out. It was a simple request, but to Butler it felt like betrayal. On October 12, 2004, an argument erupted. Fueled by paranoia, frustration, and emotional collapse, Butler snapped. He picked up a hammer and attacked Sam with catastrophic force. The blows were brutal, fueled by rage and confusion. When the attack ended, Sam Kellerman was dead. Butler tried to hide the crime by moving the body, covering it with a blanket, and setting fire to the apartment. 5 days later, firefighters discovered the body, and investigators immediately suspected foul play. Butler was eventually arrested at UCLA Medical Center, where he had checked in seeking psychiatric help. The contrast between the brutal murder and his fragile mental condition became one of the defining elements of the case. Prosecutors argued that the killing was intentional. Others believed it was the tragic result of untreated mental illness and emotional collapse. In 2006, Butler pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and arson. He was sentenced to 29 years and 4 months in prison. His career, his friendships, and his future were gone in an instant. The tragedy of James Butler is not only that he killed a friend, but that so many warning signs were ignored. His post-fight sucker punch, his emotional instability, his untreated bipolar disorder. The pressures of the boxing world, the lack of support systems, and the stigma around mental illness all contributed to a situation that spiraled out of control. At its core, Butler's story is about the danger of unaddressed psychological wounds. The Harlem Hammer was known for the force of his punches. In the end, the greatest blow he ever landed destroyed not an opponent, but the person who tried to help him. Boxer 4, Esteban de Jesus, the champion destroyed by addiction. Esteban de Jesus was a boxer of extraordinary talent, a man whose skill and technique placed him among the greatest lightweights of his era. He was the first fighter to defeat the legendary Roberto Duran, a moment that immediately cemented his place in the history of the sport. But while the world admired his precision, his speed, and his brilliance inside the ring, few understood the internal struggle that would ultimately destroy his life. From the outside, de Jesus appeared to be a disciplined athlete. But behind the scenes, he was trapped in a growing addiction to cocaine, heroin, and the hard party lifestyle that consumed much of the sports world in the 1970s and 80s. As his fame increased, so did his dependence on drugs. What began as recreational use spiraled into a daily necessity. His training suffered, his judgment eroded, his relationships collapsed. By the late 1970s, his addiction was no longer a secret. Trainers noticed he was showing up late to the gym, skipping sessions entirely, or arriving visibly high. Friends tried to intervene. Family pleaded with him. But de Jesus, like many addicts, believed he was in control. He was not. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving weekend in 1980. On a street in San Juan, Puerto Rico, De Jesus became involved in a traffic argument with an 18-year-old construction worker named Roberto Cintron Gonzalez. Witnesses later said De Jesus appeared agitated, angry, and possibly high. The argument escalated fast. In a moment of drug-fueled impulse, De Jesus pulled out a .25 caliber pistol and shot Gonzalez in the head. The young man died 3 days later. De Jesus was arrested shortly after. In the interrogation room, he claimed he remembered nothing. He insisted he had blacked out completely. Doctors and experts later explained that heavy cocaine and heroin use can cause severe memory gaps and dissociation, leaving the user functioning on instinct rather than conscious decision-making. But the law had no room for excuses. De Jesus was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. His career ended instantly. His fame evaporated. His legacy collapsed. Friends and fans were shocked, unable to comprehend how a man so talented could fall so far. Yet what happened next revealed the deepest layer of his story. In prison, stripped of fame and surrounded by consequences he could no longer escape, De Jesus changed completely. He became a born-again Christian. He dedicated his days to spiritual study and to helping other inmates break free from addiction. He preached about the dangers of drugs, using his own downfall as a lesson. Even Roberto Duran, his old rival, visited him in prison and expressed forgiveness, calling him a brother. But the years of addiction had taken a permanent toll on his body. In 1985, his brother Enrique died of AIDS. Shortly afterward, De Jesus learned that he too was HIV positive. The two brothers had shared needles during their years of drug use. As his health declined, the governor of Puerto Rico granted him clemency so he could spend his final days with his family. Esteban De Jesus died in 1989 at just 38 years old. Once a strong, brilliant champion, he weighed less than 120 pounds at the time of his death. His fall remains one of the most tragic in the history of boxing. Not because he lost a fight, but because addiction took everything from him before he even realized he was losing. Boxer 5, Emil Griffith, the man who killed in a legal arena. The story of Emil Griffith is unlike the others in this documentary. His killing did not happen in a home, a street, or a moment of uncontrollable rage. It happened under bright lights, in front of cameras, inside the most regulated environment in sports, the boxing ring. And yet, the emotional and cultural weight of what happened that night in 1962 reverberated far beyond the ropes. Griffith was a gifted welterweight champion, known for his elegance in the ring and his reserved personality outside of it. But he carried a secret that could destroy careers in his era. Griffith was a closeted gay man living in the early 1960s, a time when homosexuality was stigmatized, criminalized, and weaponized. He lived in fear of exposure, constantly navigating a society that demanded he hide who he was. His rival, Benny the Kid Perret, knew this. Before their third fight at Madison Square Garden, the two men faced each other during the weigh-in. Tensions were already high after Perret had insulted Griffith in previous encounters. But this time, Perret crossed a line. He touched Griffith's backside, mocked him with sexually suggestive gestures, and called him a maricón, a Spanish slur meaning faggot. The humiliation was public, brutal, and deeply personal. For Griffith, the insult reopened wounds he had spent a lifetime hiding. When the fight began, the tension was palpable. Both men fought aggressively, but Griffith carried a deeper emotional charge. Round after round, the fight grew more violent. By the 12th round, something inside Griffith snapped. He cornered Perret against the ropes and unleashed a barrage of punches that would become one of the most infamous sequences in boxing history. The referee tried to intervene, but it was too late. Griffith delivered more than 20 unanswered punches, rapid-fire uppercuts with devastating force. Perret hung on the ropes, unconscious but still absorbing blows. His body sagged into a crucifix-like shape. The crowd fell silent. Commentators pleaded for the fight to stop. When the referee finally stepped in, the damage was irreversible. Benny Paret slipped into a coma and died 10 days later. Griffith won the fight, but the victory destroyed a part of him. Reporters questioned his motives. Critics called the assault excessive. Griffith faced public scrutiny not just for the death, but for the accusation that personal hatred had fueled the fatal barrage. Behind closed doors, the guilt crushed him. Griffith spent years haunted by Paret's death. He often woke from nightmares where he saw Paret suspended on the ropes, helpless. He struggled with identity, shame, and the fear of judgment. When he later came out as bisexual, he explained how the world forgave him for killing a man, yet never forgave him for loving one. His story sparked national discussions about violence in boxing, the responsibility of referees, and the role of homophobia in sports. It also exposed a painful truth. The ring may be a legal arena for violence, but the emotions carried into it are deeply human and sometimes devastating. Emil Griffith lived the rest of his life carrying the weight of what happened. But he also became a symbol of resilience, identity, and honesty in a world that once forced him to hide. His legacy remains complex, tragic, and profoundly human. When we look back at the lives of Edwin Valero, Carlos Monzon, James Butler, Esteban de Jesus, and Emil Griffith, a single uncomfortable truth emerges. The violence we celebrate inside the ring is not so easily contained outside of it. Society asks fighters to become controlled weapons, to abandon fear, to embrace aggression, to fight through pain, and to silence the voice that tells them to stop. But when the lights fade and the gloves come off, those instincts don't always disappear. For some, they linger. For others, they take over. Each man in this documentary carried something heavy long before tragedy struck. Valero carried neurological damage and the chaos of addiction. Monzon carried misogyny, entitlement, and decades of unchecked violence. Butler carried untreated mental illness and a lifetime of emotional instability. De Jesus carried the weight of addiction that destroyed everything he loved. And Emil Griffith carried secrets, shame, and the wounds of a world that refused to accept who he was. They were champions, victims, aggressors, icons, and cautionary tales, all at once. And while their stories stretch across different continents, generations, and circumstances, one thread connects them all: the long-term consequences of a sport that requires a man to harden himself against everything human. Boxing teaches control, but it also teaches detachment. It builds discipline, but normalizes aggression. It demands courage, but glorifies damage. And nowhere in that equation is there space to address trauma, mental health, or emotional collapse. The public loves the spectacle, the knockouts, the comebacks, the mythology of invincibility. But behind every punch thrown in victory is a punch absorbed in silence. One that might echo years later in a dark hotel room, a violent argument, a relapse, a psychotic break, or a fatal moment when all the pressure finally snaps. These 5 stories remind us that fighters are not made of stone. They are not machines built for our entertainment. They are human beings shaped by pain, fear, expectation, and the environments that demand perfection while offering little support. The tragedies we examine today did not begin with the crimes themselves. They began with neglect, medical, emotional, social, and legal. They began with the cultural myth that a fighter must be unbreakable. And they continued because society is far more comfortable celebrating violence in the ring than confronting the damage it leaves behind. If anything is to change, the world of boxing must learn to care for its fighters long after the applause ends. Brain scans, mental health support, addiction treatment, real accountability, and a culture that sees fighters as people first, athletes second. But until then, these stories stand as a mirror, a stark reflection of what happens when the skills that create champions become the forces that destroy lives. The bell may stop ringing inside the arena, but for some fighters, it never stops echoing in their minds. And that is the true cost of the sport.